Welcome everyone to Workplace Conversations podcast. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my next guest, Patrick Dunlop. Hi, Patrick. How are you?
Hi, good day, Paul. I'm well, thank you.
That's great. Patrick is an academic researcher from Curtin University, and I was very keen to get Patrick on the show because I want to get into some really interesting issues around selection, in particular, candidate selection through the hiring process. Tell me a little bit about, or tell the audience a little bit about, your background and where your focus is, Patrick.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a professor at the Future of Work Institute, which is part of Curtin University, as you mentioned. I'm also a registered psychologist with endorsement in the area of organizational psychology. So for those of you in Australia who are watching this, you will know that we've got an accreditation process for our psychologists, and organizational psychology is sort of like an area of practice. Professionally, though, I spend most of my time doing research, and my particular area of interest in terms of academic research is recruitment and assessment and selection, and all the questions that are orbiting those topics right now. So like what's the best way to assess job candidates? What assessments are considered valid, reliable? How do you choose which assessments to use? I'm also interested in understanding the candidate experience. So what is it about an assessment process that can sometimes upset or irritate candidates, and what you can do to do something about that. And finally, the big topic at the moment is technology, especially AI, as we all like to call it. That's proving to be a huge disruptor in this space.
Yeah, so that's exactly what we want to get into. So that's really good. So why don't we start with this idea of a selection process? There are so many people whose selection process is interview and reference check, and that's where it sort of starts and stops. What are your thoughts around what it makes up a good selection process in the average hiring process?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the starting point for a good selection process is some kind of analysis of the job that you're trying to fill. And I think often this gets skipped or it gets done on the fly. And basically the goal of a job analysis is to answer the question, what are we looking for? What are the characteristics that we need our new employee or employees to have to be able to perform well? And to answer that, you need to understand, well, what does performing well look like? What is it that this person has to do? So we often say start with a job analysis, and then the rest of it will fall into place. And you're quite right. I think it's very common for the process to be resume, some kind of screening process, and then an interview, and then a follow-up reference check. And I suppose like my response to is that a good process or not? I think it really depends, right? So the resumes are very controversial at the moment, especially with large language models. But I think there's always been rumors that the resume or the CV is dead. But it does serve a useful purpose. Like, for example, if you're looking to appoint an engineer, you probably need some way of working out if somebody's got an engineering degree, because if they don't, then they're a non-starter for an engineering role. And so, resumes are the way we've been communicating that kind of information throughout history. But there are a lot of problems with resumes, but we can get into those a bit later. Interviews, another thing that, the current evidence on which assessments are the most effective at giving you indicators of how well somebody will go on the job. Well, the latest evidence suggests that structured interviews are among the best tools that we have. The trouble is, everyone thinks they're doing a structured interview, but actually it's not a binary, we have structure versus we don't have structure. There's actually lots of components to structure, and those components can be quite important. And the same goes with reference checks as well. So a reference check could just be, hey, Paul, I'm just calling up. What do you think of John? Was he good? And you say, yeah, he was pretty good. And that's the end of the reference check. Or they can be conducted in a highly structured way, like a structured interview, where you have, a set of questions you want to ask the referees. You have some rating scales, and so forth. And some people call one referee, others call several. And much like structured interviews, the more structure you have in a reference check, the more confident you can be in that.
Yeah. So what are the things I was going to say? What are the things that make a good structured? But let's flip it on the other side. What do we commonly see that undermines a good structured interview? What are people doing that is actually lowering the predictive power of a structured interview?
Yeah, I guess there's a few ways you can compromise the structure. Probably the classic way is to ask different questions to different candidates, right? So you haven't prepared a set of questions, or you've looked at somebody's resume and you've thought, oh, I've got to ask this guy this question about that, but I'm not going to ask the other candidate the same question. That's a good way to screw up a structured interview. Another way to screw up a structured interview is to not have any kind of agreed standards around what a good response to a question is. So like I saw on LinkedIn recently, someone had the idea, or maybe we should ask a job candidate how they've used a large language model recently to solve a problem. And that sounds like a great idea if you want to assess somebody's AI capacity. But unless you've all sat around and agreed on what a good example is of using a large language model and what a bad example is, what you'll find is different people will have different interpretations of the same answer. So I think having clear standards about what's good, what's average, what's poor, or reasonable or poor. And also another good way to compromise structure, if that's what you want to do, is to have fewer people involved in the interview process. And of course, in a small business, it might not be possible to form a panel, and that's fine. You can do the other things, but if you have the capability to have multiple evaluators, that's also good practice for improving structure. But one caveat to that is you don't want the evaluators talking to each other before they've done their evaluations. You want those people to independently do those evaluations using a standard set of agreed criteria already. And then you don't let the discussion unfold until all those ratings have been locked in, if you like.
Yeah, so I've seen processes where there's been a good start and middle in regards to creating criteria and following that criteria through interview and so on. But then we get to 3, 4, 5 panel member discussion, and the criteria is not even looked at. It's then a bit of a free-for-all, and then you get the potential for groupthink as well.
Yeah, I think there's a risk of that too when you might have somebody on the panel who's particularly influential, right? So, the team leader or the university, it might be some senior professor that nobody wants to upset or everybody wants to try and impress.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. So what do you think is realistic around the predictive power of a selection process? I'm assuming that we'll probably say that there's no chance that we could ever get to 90 or 100% prediction of high performance. Would that be right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's very hard to predict, well, anything when it comes to humans, really. And the thing is that one of the forces that acts against people like us who try to sell the message of, you should use these rigorous procedures is everybody remembers the time where they did that, but they hired somebody, but, turned out to be no good. And I suppose another way of putting that is the evidence that we often use to justify the choice of assessments like interviews or cognitive tests or whatever they are. It's an aggregation. It's like this is the on average what if you use these assessments to make thousands and thousands of decisions, on average you'll shift the needle a little bit more in your favor than if you decide not to use those things. A good metaphor I use to people who've ever been to a casino before is the roulette wheel, right? You know, for example, if you're betting on red, that you've got a less than 50% chance of winning because there's equal numbers of red numbers and black numbers, but there's the zero, which sort of tips the odds into the casino's favor. But if you imagine that you could get a red marker out and change some of those black numbers into red numbers, then the betting would be in your favor. So that's kind of what we're trying to do with these rigorous selection tools. We're trying to make it so that on average you will win more often than you will lose.
Yes. So do you recommend that organizations go beyond, should they be focusing on the structured interview, or should they be like the true structured interview, or should they be focusing on the true structured interview as well as adding additional tools? And if so, what tools do you think are good ideas to use?
Yeah, I think that there are a range of tools that have been well researched, and of course there are new tools coming out which may or may not prove to be effective. And it also depends what you put into the structured interview, and that should be determined by your job analysis. There's a whole bunch of caveats, which is pretty classic when you talk to an academic. You get "it depends" type responses. But there's kind of characteristics that are not captured too well by, I mean, they're captured in some respects by interviews, but you can get more information if you include additional predictors. So cognitive testing might, in some circumstances, provide some new insights that can add predictive power, but also make up it's not already captured by interviews. And they're also good for scale, right? So conducting a structured interview is not easy when you've got 1,000 candidates. Like that's a lot of time and energy, and it may be that the amount that you save in missing out on hiring bad people isn't justified by the time it takes to do that.
Yeah.
Other sorts of assessments that are interesting are things like personality assessments, and you know they don't explain a lot of it. They don't give you a lot of detail about how well somebody will perform in the job, but there are some characteristics that are indicative. So conscientiousness is the big one. That sort of indicates how hard somebody works, how diligent they are. You know, can they be relied on, and so forth. There's some new evidence recently that came out that suggested that vocational interest inventories might also be predictive, and the big twist there is for a long time we were taught, you know, don't use interest inventories. So by the way, these are inventories that a lot of students might take them when they're trying to figure out what they want to be. So do you like to work outdoors? Do you like to work with tools and machines, or do you prefer to work with people, and so forth? And you know, the old evidence was don't bother using these things for selection because they're not indicative of performance. But what we've discovered now that there's a lot more data available, some researchers have worked out that they actually do predict. It's just that the context has to be relevant. So if you're trying to understand whether or not an interest in people will predict job performance, but the job doesn't involve working with people, it's not a very indicative. It's because it doesn't matter if you're just programming on a computer all day. It doesn't matter if you like working with people or not. But if if the job involves working with people, then having somebody who's interested in working with people is a good thing. And there's now empirical evidence to support that. So some of this stuff may get picked up during the interview, but you might find if you're wanting to capture this information and you can't interview everybody, then you've got these alternative types of assessments that are very useful.
Yeah. So going back to the personality profiling, if you've got conscientiousness as being the primary facet, if you like, for the prediction of performance generally, does that mean that the rest of the other facets are not really adding a lot of value?
Well, I think if you look at all jobs in one study, then there's probably some truth to that, right? So if you had no information about a job, and you know, your best bet is conscientiousness. But what you do find is that there's a lot of variability around those estimates of how predictive these traits are, and one source of that variability is the nature of the work that the person in the job's going to be doing. So you would find, so the thing about conscientiousness, it's really a work trait, right? It's all about getting stuff done, and there aren't too many jobs in the world where the job is not getting stuff done, right? So that's why it tends to be quite a reasonable predictor in the context of many jobs. But you know, take a trait like extroversion. Of course, all of these big traits from the Big Five model or the hexaco model, if you're familiar with that, they're complicated. You know, they're just a big blob of stuff that we've squished together and called it extroversion. But there's actually nuances there. You know, so one aspect of extroversion might be, you know, wanting to socialize. Another might be being really bold, so speaking out in meetings, or you know, putting your hand up and asking a question when there's 1,000 people in the audience. And those different facets also may have certain relevance for certain jobs. I mean, a good way to think of it in theoretical terms is that, you know, there's a theory called trait activation theory, which kind of describes this idea that we have these kind of traits whizzing around in our minds, and they motivate us to do things. So if you're an extrovert, you know, there's a little extrovert neuron buzzing. You know, it's a metaphor, obviously, but there's this little extrovert energy buzzing around in my head, and it's telling me, "Oh, Pat, you need to go to that party." And then when you get to that party, you need to, you know, go talk to people. And if I was introverted, it would say, "Don't go to the party," or if you're stuck in a party, go grab a drink and sit at the bar by yourself. So these situations kind of activate the traits, and so if you extend that to a work setting, you find. The evidence suggests that in very predictable and sensible ways, certain types of jobs activate certain traits, and those traits then become useful for somebody to support performance in a particular role. So, for example, an academic, I wouldn't be surprised if there was research out there that suggested like a trait like curiosity would predict research performance, because you have to be curious to be able to do that.
Yes. So that comes down to, once again, being really clear on what the success factors are, what the competencies are. And then if you're using something like a personality profile, that you're making a direct link between the specific capability and then what that will then show, and then also pairing it with other data that they've received through the selection process.
I think also the other dimension I'll add into the personality piece is we've also learned too that you can do things to personality inventories to improve how predictive they are. And probably one of the biggest, when you see it done and hear the result, it's kind of obvious in hindsight, but it took a while for us to get there. But one example is if you contextualize the personality items. So, we know we kind of wear different hats. So we do have personalities that are quite stable across situations. And what I mean by that is you're not going to get someone who's super extroverted at work and then super introverted when they're with their friends. But we do put hats on, and to some extent. So you might, take me for an example. I'm quite an introverted person normally, but I'm quite happy to give a lecture. I quite enjoy lecturing, and it's part of my job. So I can kind of be extroverted, and it's a genuine, I get genuine joy out of that kind of activity. But outside of work, I'm just not that interested in getting up and giving a speech to people.
Yeah.
And so we found that when you contextualize personality questionnaires, and that usually just involves, making sure the items are work relevant and then asking people to think about their personalities at work, you do tend to be more predictive than your kind of classic neo style questionnaires that were just developed for research or for clinical reasons.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, contextualizing it to the work scenario. I'm just thinking of some of the ones that I've used before that perhaps could do with being a bit more contextualized as well. Yeah. Let's talk about artificial intelligence. My reading of artificial intelligence at the moment is that it tends to be focused on improving the efficiency of the recruitment process, but less so at the moment about the effectiveness of the recruitment process. Your thoughts on that?
Well, it's hard to tell really because there's not a lot of data, right? Certainly the impetus for using it, you're right, is efficiency. And I suppose the other thing I see when this is not a systematic study. I'm sure there are groups out there that have done this. But when I just look through my LinkedIn feed, the two things I always see are, about messages about efficiency and messages about reducing bias and discrimination using AI. Or improving diversity is another lens. I never ever see organizations that sell AI products talk about predicting performance better or validity. I'm going to use it. That's a dirty word, I think, on LinkedIn. But it does seem. It makes sense because that's really what automation is supposed to be for anyway, right? We automate things because it's faster than doing them ourselves. And there's so many different ways a good way to design an AI product is just think, what do recruiters hate doing and hate spending a long time doing? And it's things like, reading big stacks of resumes, cover letters, that kind of stuff. So of course, I think that's what drives the demand for these products. But going back to your question about effectiveness, I guess it depends what you mean by effectiveness. Like, in terms of making better decisions, even that, what does that even mean? It depends on the organization's goal. But if you're assuming you're trying to predict performance and you're trying to look for the star performers, I don't know if there's any evidence that these tools can do that. There is a paper that came out recently in the Journal of Applied Psychology, which is sort of what organizational psychologists think of as one of the top journals, where they've looked at AI, an algorithmic approach to scoring asynchronous or one-way video interviews. And they showed actually these models that they've designed. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there, but one of the things they showed is they can actually predict people's job performance using these algorithms if they're trained on human judgment. But this is a super rigorous study, huge data, lots of data sets, lots of measures of performance. I was really impressed by the work. And I'm not convinced that many AI products have that backing.
Yes. There's one that I know of that is looking at task-based activities to predict potential to perform. So what it's working on is the basis that there's a difference between a person telling you, for instance, what their behavioral preferences are or their skills are, and them showing you what their skills and capabilities are, but particularly looking at potential as opposed to what I've got right now. What are your thoughts on that as a way to go in regards to assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to speak specifically to that tool, but one of the types of assessments that you find are quite indicative of future success are things like work samples, which, like when you take a chunk of what the person's likely to be doing in the role and you simulate that in some respect and get them to complete a similar task.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is what you're collecting there is you're collecting samples of behavior that will it's based on the idea that a person's previous behavior is likely to be indicative of their future behavior. So if you can somehow capture what their behavior looks like when they're doing something very similar to the job, there's a good chance that's what you'll see when they actually go to do the job. Of course, there's trainable stuff like, how does this organization work? What are the products that you have to sell, etc. But that's probably the underlying logic. The big questions, I think, around those sorts of assessments are, how well do they actually reflect what is actually getting done? Because the further and further you move away from that, the less indicative they probably will be of future job success. And if you move far enough away to something that you end up in psychometric testing land, right? So the idea of a cognitive ability test is you're measuring somebody's. You're not actually measuring what they would do on the job. You're measuring how well they solve problems generally, with the hope that that'll then tell us about how people will solve problems in the job. So I guess with those work sample style assessments, great if it's a perfect simulation, brilliant. That's almost like hiring somebody and getting them to work for a few hours and then deciding what to do. That's probably the best way to select somebody if all you care about is predicting performance.
Yeah. So it comes down to so much about understand the role, and you understand exactly what the success factors are, and that you're measuring the success factors and how close to reality you really are with that. So if we go back to the job analysis process, and you've got, for instance, a hiring manager who perhaps hasn't really spent the time walking in the shoes of their staff member, and therefore is looking at the job in more of a theoretical. There'll be so many hiring managers that come to the job analysis process from more of a theoretical point of view of what we should be doing. How can we move towards a situation where there's a real, more accurate understanding of the job? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I guess it's one of those situations where the more perspectives you can get, the closer to the ground truth you will get. What we often teach students when we're teaching them job analysis is, the first question is, well, who's likely to know what this job involves? And probably the person who knows best is the person who's doing the job. But there are issues with that. The person doing the job may not have awareness of the context, right? So if you're just putting widgets onto a conveyor belt and you have no idea where those widgets go, that might be enough. It might be enough to hire somebody, to design a selection process around. But the other thing too is when you ask people, like if you ask me, how hard do I work on, or how much time do I spend doing stuff, I'll probably overestimate it, right? Because there's a bit of self-interest there. It's also helpful from a line manager's perspective to get the line manager's perspective, because they understand what they need from that person, right? In a way that the person who's doing the job may not have as much insight. So I would encourage practitioners out there to consider, or the line managers to get those perspectives of the people in the job, the people who report. You might even have perspectives of clients. So at a university, you might ask students, what do you think a lecturer needs to be able to do? Because I might think I'm a brilliant lecturer, but actually the students don't think I'm teaching very well, and we wouldn't understand that if all you did was ask me what does teaching involve. So I guess the word stakeholders is probably appropriate. You get the perspectives of different stakeholders. I'll throw in a couple of other thoughts too. There are some handy tools. So the ONET website has position description type documents based on job analyses of a whole ton of different jobs. And I think Australia's got a similar framework. I think it's changed recently, but I might be misremembering that. So if you're sort of really lost, you've got these sorts of tools out there that will provide a starting point. They won't have your organization's context or cultural factors, but they will give you the basics. And it can be a good sanity check when you sort of, you do your own job analysis and you're thinking, is my role actually that special? And you could look on ONET and realize, oh, actually, no, I haven't screwed this up, because it looks like I'm getting the same characteristics that other people that have done this But one
Yeah.
thing I think about job analysis, it's kind of interesting right now because is like I wonder what the half-life of a job analysis is in the day where we've got artificial intelligence changing. Technology has always been influencing the way we do our work,
Yep.
but it just seems like it's happening faster and faster and faster.
Mm.
And part of so I sort of wonder, like, if you hired somebody in my role using a job analysis from 3 years ago, how helpful would that be now? Because I'm using
Yeah.
generative all the time, and the way I teach is different, and so forth.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether, how now there's more, and within the recruitment process, tools for recording the interview experience, for instance, and then having AI do some kind of analysis on that. I'm wondering whether we'll get to a stage where, for instance, we can record the person doing the job in real time, and then an AI starts analyzing what is making this person effective, and then that then feeding into a job analysis where there's that real time sophisticated analysis of what is actually going on in the job.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem implausible. I know there are some organizations that use AI to monitor what employees are doing. So if they're having a chat near the water cooler, it automatically logs that. It feels a bit
Yeah.
dystopian.
Yeah.
I'm also aware of AI that supports customer service agents. So they'll be on a phone call. Actually, this technology I saw, I think, 3 years ago. Again, it felt very dystopian when I watched the video, but the way it was portrayed is like, I'll be on the phone talking to you, you're calling up looking for help with I don't know, with Zoom, and this thing's prompting is listening to what you're saying and prompting me with things, not only with what I should say, but also how I should
Yep.
say it. Be more empathetic.
Yep.
You should probably crack a joke now, I think.
Yeah.
And the thing is, with that is, if I decide, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to be autonomous, that also gets logged, right? And then
Yeah.
potentially I'm getting a lower satisfaction rating. My supervisor might say, well, hey, listen, Pat, why didn't you do what the algorithm said? And
Yes.
a lot of my colleagues are really interested in what effect this has on people's motivation and well-being and so forth. But yeah,
Yes.
to probably use that as a foundation for designing assessments. I mean, of course, it's easy to say, but much more
Yeah.
difficult to put into practice. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of the concerns will end up becoming a bit benign, but there certainly is the potential for some things to become concerning.
Mm.
The idea that you would have, I mean, this is the joke about the GPS, where you take a wrong turn, and in the future the GPS will tell you off for turning left, and that it'll become more interactive with you. As you say, if it comes to the point where it's starting to criticize you, or you might as well install an avatar rather than the human doing the job, because if you're getting in trouble for not following the AI knowledge, well, you might as well not be there, hey?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing everyone's worried about, right? Being replaced
Yeah,
by an avatar.
yeah. And I think what do can you talk about candidate experience? The thought about one of the big problems that I've seen and seen a lot of discussion about is that recruitment, particularly say we focus on recruitment agencies for a moment, but also to some degree organizations, they don't have the time, and they're unlikely to ever find the time to be able to provide quality feedback to the overwhelming majority of candidates who apply.
Hmm.
So you then introduce the idea of an avatar that does provide useful feedback. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I know there are products like this already available, and in fact, I was chatting with somebody who's got something like that could do this. Um, I think, it's mostly a good thing. I mean, the funny thing is we've had the capability to do this sort of thing for a long time. So if you've ever done a personality assessment with one of the more well-known providers, they all have candidate reports that don't really cost much to produce. They're automated.
Yep.
They're not using
Yep.
AI, but if they were invented today, we'd be calling it AI.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yet, I
Yes.
don't think many organizations were using those or sharing those with candidates. And I
Yeah.
never really understood, like, understand, if we give them something to complain about, they'll complain. But
Mm.
I've never understood the maths. It's like, okay, well, yes, that's a risk, and surely you can manage that, versus
Yes.
about the benefit to the
Yep.
candidates, giving you all this personal information and you're giving them nothing. Like that,
Yep.
these poor people who often have applied for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 jobs and have no clue what they're doing wrong.
Yep.
So I think there's potential good there, and I think a large language model based approach is quite promising, because they seem to do a pretty good job of a pretty good. There's not amazing, but pretty good.
Mm.
Not amazing compared to 5 years ago, but a
Yep.
pretty good job of capturing key points. And I've used ChatGPT just for fun as an interview coach, just to sort of suss out its capabilities, and it's
Yes.
good at providing constructive suggestions.
Yep.
Um, yeah, there are some issues there. I mean, one of the issues might be if it hasn't picked up the transcript very well, and it hasn't really understood, very well what was going on.
Yeah.
It can hallucinate. It can just, invent things, because it's not really that interested in the truth. It's just interested in predicting words. So
Mm.
it might produce some falsehoods. Maybe over time these creases will be ironed out.
Yeah.
My sense is, and so I guess there are some risks there, having this unmonitored machine that's giving feedback to people. You can put guardrails in, you can set it with system prompts to keep certain, make sure certain things are off topic. Like, you don't want to be getting into discussion about people's sexuality or something during an
Yeah.
AI feedback session.
Yeah.
Um, and a large language model might think it's a good idea to do that. So that,
Yeah.
there are guardrails, I think, that need to be considered.
Yeah.
But I think the way to do it is to is really to get some data, right? So you want to consider doing some research that looks at how people react to this.
Mm.
I can
Mm.
see some people might feel quite cynical about it. It's like, oh, you still didn't want to call me back, so you gave me this AI feedback. Well,
Yep.
I don't like AI. I don't trust it. It's just
Mm.
vanilla, bland. It's not helpful. Others
Yep.
might be more sympathetic. Like, yeah, I mean, I get it. You can't call all 2,000 of us. And actually, I appreciate the
Mm.
fact that you even thought to give me feedback.
Yes.
So I think it's a bit unclear at the
Yep.
moment. But
Hmm.
certainly, I'm always up for trying things, right? So I think it's
Yep.
worth looking into.
Yeah. From your point of view, anything else you'd add to the selection of assessment tools from your point of view, that if you were advising a hiring manager around good assessment practice, good selection practice, anything that you would uh, add into the equation?
Well, I think the big thing on my mind at the moment is candidates having access to large language models and using these large language models for unprompted assessments, or assessments they do at home or on their mobile device somewhere.
Yeah.
So I've been involved with some research which has looked into aptitude testing, and we found
Yeah.
that the ChatGPT, the old model you can't even click on in the website anymore. It's defunct, but the new model is excellent at verbal reasoning tests. It gets, it scores at the 90th percentile compared to a bunch of human test takers. The
Yeah.
numeracy test, the model struggled with that, even the advanced model. But then OpenAI released a new, it's not a new model, but it's a new way of interacting with their advanced model, and this method aces the numeracy test as well. And so
Right.
it's pretty clear that over time, I mean, I don't know if you probably know this, but if ChatGPT can also take multimodal information. So you can take a photo, for example, of a chart and say, okay, I need to solve this problem that's shown in this chart.
Yeah.
Abstract reasoning questions, you can give those to these models. I find like the ChatGPT is pretty hopeless at it like almost gaslights you into thinking the wrong answer is right. It's very charismatic,
Uh,
tells you why you should pick answer C when it's not right.
right.
But
Okay.
that's hey, give it a year, and I think this stuff will be trivial. So I think what sort of worries me about this is not that I think everyone's out there trying to cheat or anything. It's just that if enough people do it, then the validity of an assessment can decline, because you tend to rank, when you're doing high volume assessments, you tend to rank people and then pick from the top, work your way down. And the
Mm.
people who cheat, we know this from personality faking studies, that people that are good at it end up at the top of these ranked lists at the cost of people that are responding honestly.
Yep.
The other force that I worry about is like, I might not be inclined to cheat normally, but if I discover that everyone else is doing it, or I
Mm.
believe everybody else is doing it, then
Mm.
that creates like an external impetus that, independent of my personality or my moral code, it's like I still need a job, I
Mm.
still have a mortgage, and so forth. So
Yeah.
temptation to go down that path. So I think that's something like
Yep.
people in our field probably need to think a little bit more about is how they're managing that risk.
Yes.
There's a few ways you can do that. You can look at messaging around it. So you can, I think there's an assessment vendor in the UK called Arctic Shores, who I think you're familiar with, but they
Yeah.
have some really good advice, I think. I mean, it's not evidence-based, but I think over time the evidence will come out. My intuition is that the advice they're giving is good. It's sort of explaining clearly what circumstances justify the use of AI and when to encourage it versus
Yeah.
where you're kind of taking the mickey a little bit if you're using it for this.
Yeah.
I think that's good because it sort of educates candidates on the importance of authenticity when you're applying for a job. Like I might trick my
Yes.
way into a job as an engineer, but one day you're going to work out that I can't build a bridge, and that's pretty awkward for everybody. So there is a
Yeah.
incentive not to just lie and cheat.
Mm.
And we're grappling with this in universities. But the other factor
Yep.
is with proctored assessments, we're probably only days away from, let's say Meta, the Facebook company, right? They just released smart glasses, which have they have a little lens somewhere in here, and it can project text on there. And the demos were great. They showed situations where you and I are talking to each other, and I can see subtitles when you speak, which must be great if I'm pretty hard of hearing. So that would be incredibly helpful. But it's not
Yep.
hard to imagine that I'm looking at a math problem on a piece of paper and I've got a pen in my hand because I'm doing paper and pencil testing, and then
Yep.
my smart glasses are telling me how to solve that maths problem.
Yes.
So
Yes.
but having said all of that, if that's how the world is, maybe you don't need to measure maths problem solving ability anymore because I'll be looking at things
That's
that work
right.
with those
Because
glasses on
that,
too.
yes, yeah, that's right. It takes what is the relevant capability to a different domain, doesn't it?
Well, that's the other side that I'm really interested in right now is probably we're going to find certain characteristics that we used to think were important for success will become less important because AI
Yes.
can help with those. And
Yes.
probably other characteristics that we previously didn't think were that important that may prove to be critical, right? So in terms of like if you've used generative AI, there's an art to prompting it, right? You can get basic
Mm.
stuff done with basic prompts, but getting complex stuff done often requires you to try little tricks like you're asking it to take on a persona or having a to and fro with it rather than just giving it.
Yes.
And so what characteristics I'm wondering are indicative of somebody's knack for that? There's some people
Yeah.
that you can train them, they still don't get it. Other people just,
Yes.
as soon as it came out, they immediately were using it for all kinds of funky stuff, even though no one
Yes.
knows how to train people on this.
Yes.
So those traits might become quite important for job success in roles
Yes.
where there's a lot of AI use.
Yes. Fascinating stuff. We could talk for hours, but we might need to pull the plug on this one for today. But I would actually really love to have you back on and have some further discussions about this. I'm sure that you're incredibly busy, but there is so much more that I would genuinely love to chat to you about on in regards to candidate selection. So thank you, Patrick, for being on the program. A wealth of knowledge, stimulated, I'm sure people who are listening, lots of different thoughts and ideas that they can take forward. So thanks very much. Until next time.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Right. Thanks, Pat.